Okay, folks, back here with Shah one more time, and today we're going to attempt to do the impossible, which is to define masculinity, or at least have a discussion about the definition of masculinity and how that has come to pass over the years and what we're dealing with now. Shah, the first thing that struck me as I was just looking back on ancient Egypt and the more aged African civilizations across the globe, we have a pretty consistent picture of what old societies thought masculinity was. Some of it's from archaeological evidence, looking at what men were buried with, the things that were symbolic of their lives, even in pre or at least back to Sumerian before there was even writing. We had artifacts that gave us an idea of what was viewed as masculine and feminine, and they're pretty predictable: strength, financial wealth, power in the pastoral societies, the size of herds, all those things played into what was viewed as masculinity. And we turn around and here we are in 2025, and men are judged by the worth of their cars, their bank accounts, their jobs, how much power they have. Uh, but we have this also, this sort of quiet war raging about what is real masculinity. Well, and one of the things that occurred to me before we dig into this, and I think we have to keep in mind before even trying to define what masculinity is that the moment, at least in modern society, the moment that you let others define what masculinity is, you've handed them the power to control you. Because men are controlled by shame when they're told they're not real men or they're not men at all. Anytime they don't fulfill this role of social expectations, somebody in our society says, first insult is you're not a man.
uh, I think that's a great point, and that's one of the things I was thinking about as well when I kind of sat down and thought, okay, what is masculinity exactly? And there are a lot of maybe common sense notions that are thrown around in the culture that come from different places. At least more recently, historically is one thing. Then there's recently, like you might have feminists that'll say this is what a real man is, or you might have a traditional conservative that says this is what a real man is. Then
You
you
might
have
have lots of those.
yeah, and then you'll have a lot of red pillars and stuff, and they'll give their opinion on what true masculinity is, and things like that, and what qualifies whether they're depending on who they are in the space. And there is I think a war, kind of like you mentioned, is the right way to describe it. There is this war to define masculinity because whoever can have that prevailing narrative, they win by getting men into whatever role or in whatever position they want men to be.
And I see this mostly, I mean, I think our public square of communication, Twitter, or currently called X, is where you see a lot of this. You can see a lot of this play out in real time in discussions with people. And it's always the tradcons to me. I mean, yeah, feminists come in and call you a, a incel or some other insult, also implying that you're not a real man because you can't attract women.
Hmm.
But it is the tradcons that come in, especially with when they're trying to address red pill guys and want to give us their definition of what a real man is and how we're not that and how we should be. And I wonder if this is born in tradcons out of a sense of insecurity, uh,
I
needing to reinforce their ideas of their own masculinity by lowering the masculinity of others.
I think that's true. I mean, when I look at it, there's a discussion that's a lot of times when I look at feminists and tradcons too, especially tradcon women, it tends to be that either of them will define masculinity on what benefits them. And it's usually, it's some kind of utility value, whether it's like protect or provide or, do this, and a real man will do that kind of thing. And if you're not doing that, then you're not masculine basically. And if you're looking out for yourself or you're, trying to protect yourself from, let's say, a bad deal of marriage or something, it's like, how dare you expect her to bring some kind of finances to the table? Your masculinity should be in question. And they do that with the men's rights movement as a whole, right? Like if men are trying to get laws changed that are equal between men and women instead of just being biased towards one side, they're going to call our manhoods into question and say, oh, so, sometimes they'll say, well, you're not a real man or you're just a feminist yourself, basically.
Yeah, I get that one a lot too, that basically because you expect a woman in 2025, of all things, to actually bring some financial value to a relationship, that basically you're a feminist. That's the rationale.
Y- Yeah, and you mentioned this kind of historical understanding earlier, and that's something I've tried to look at also, especially when it came to studying about dowry and bride prices and things. And there is an aspect that I do believe culture, to some extent plays on what maybe aspects of masculinity are best required for survivability at the time or what makes the most sense. But if you look at, let's say, bride price paying societies, and women very much had a labor value and they produced income by working on the fields and helping out with agriculture there. So a woman working isn't this, thing that's going to make you seem not masculine if you expect that. Later on, with the rise of dowry societies, once plow agriculture comes in, and it takes a lot of upper body burst strength to control the animals that are pulling this plow, and you got to keep the plow straight so it makes the furrow in the right direction without going off course. That leads to an increase of things, and it's something that women have a harder time doing, so they kind of end up being more involved in housebound activity versus out on the field. And then after, many years of that, maybe notions of a man and woman's role starts to change for whatever works best in survivability. So when I look at kind of changes like that, I think, okay, there is some aspect of masculinity that changes given whatever, maybe economic or socioeconomic circumstances we happen to find ourselves in.
And that makes perfect sense. I mean, if you go back and refer to places like Proverbs in the Bible, there were express instructions for women to produce income
Yeah.
for their homes. That is part of the deal. And I don't think, and I may not be able to prove it yet, but I
Mhm.
think at some point we will be able to prove that there was never a time in human history where there was no expectation for women to bring value above and beyond bearing children. That there was never a time that that ever happened until the advent of romantic chivalry in the West. And now it's basically it's how you get all these tradcons on Twitter and other platforms saying basically you need to coddle a little princess. You need to make sure that she never breaks a nail, that she her hands aren't dirtied by manual work, and that she lives a life basically of leisure and privilege. And that seems to be the thing, that if you can't produce that for a woman, you're not a real man.
Yeah, that's the more recent quote unquote traditional narrative that they're putting out there. And I see the same thing looking back. I mean, women worked and contributed and did way beyond what was just the bearing of children and then sitting back and looking pretty, I guess. Um, but
Even
now,
in societies with a plow, there was plenty of work
yeah. Yeah,
needed
oh,
to be
yeah.
done.
There's all kinds of stuff to be done. Well, and you can even say nowadays with all our technology, a lot of those, a lot of these jobs are just things that women, I guess, would take more time is made so much more easier for them, in a sense of like, I don't know, let's say a dishwasher, vacuums, or washing machines. And there was a ton of stuff to do that they, were doing. The difference in what makes it, because the TradCon will say, well, they'll usually name some things and they'll say that now makes it justified that I'm married to a superstar athlete and therefore half of his money's mine. But there is a very real market value to what they're doing compared to the differences in income of, let's say, what men were doing in that time. And the economics in that sense, when you look at what women actually do, it has a set value that really doesn't change on their end. But for men, it would tend to be different, higher and lower. So what I find from women, especially tradcon women, is what they'll say is like, well, we give birth and that has effects on our bodies or something. They'll come up with all these things to kind of
Stretch
maximize
marks.
their contribution and say it equals yours, even though there's a clear difference in labor value and income heterogeneity on the other side. So then that brings in this question of when if you challenge that, then they're going to say, well, a real man wouldn't do that. I actually have a Twitter post here from a kind of prominent tradcon, and I think it can maybe start us off at least in giving us one
Okay.
definition of what this person says masculinity is.
I want to say just before you bring that up
Mm-hmm.
that as you were talking, it made me think this is, I think, the only time in human history where women have considered getting some stretch marks and having sagging boobs as some sort of sacrifice that they've given to a man for a marriage.
Yeah, I mean, and it's such a strange thing, and then what they'll say is that it's weird because what it calls to mind is that this woman actually resents her husband, and then if you take it a step further, she resents her husband so much that she resents also her child who was born from her because it's she was impregnated by that man, so she's just like, oh well, I had to sacrifice my body, which it's both of the husband and the wife's children, the man and the woman. So to sit there and say the man owes some sort of debt to her is, it's just that's just some kind of
Her, her,
womanese.
her stretch marks don't have near the impact as his herniated discs and other injuries and things that he does to contribute labor. Uh,
Exactly. And there's another aspect to that too. It also goes into the upbringing and the nutrition of the woman. If we really want to get in the weeds, women who are brought up with better nutrition and healthier are going to have an easier time doing this. If they're living a sedentary lifestyle and eating goldfish crackers and Kool-Aid their whole life, and then childbirth's going to be tough for them, maybe they should be mad at their parents for bringing them up in a way that's not good versus, blaming her husband 20 years down the line. So,
Something,
yeah.
I'm going to jump on that wagon for a moment and
Mhm.
say I do think that there is a legitimate finger to point at weak fathers
Yeah.
for raising entitled women.
Yeah, very much so. Oh god, that reminds me of a Twitter thing that I saw, and there was a big Twitter story over the last week, and it was about a man who wanted to take his son and his nephew on a boys trip, basically like fishing or some kind of deal like that. And the mom was upset that they weren't taking the daughter, basically. And so that went back and forth and all this, and the daughter ended up being a little sad about it. And the mom, instead of backing up the dad and being there to comfort the daughter, basically is complicit in turning the daughter against the husband. But there are all these people commenting, and one of them was saying like, well, when my son cries, that's not a big deal, but when my daughter cries, it's like the end of the world. And it's almost like this romantic love pedestalization, moving from a romantic interest to your daughter, and it brings them up to expect that kind of treatment.
It's exactly what it is. I don't think it's almost like that. I think it's men raising their daughters in the romantic ethos, and it absolutely destroys their character to do
Yes,
it that way.
exactly. I'm just going to go ahead and share this screen here real quick, so hopefully you can see that. This is from Lila Rose. She's a well-known character in the even on the men's side of things because she participates in a lot of discussions there. But it's a she says dads can go unnoticed for the quiet daily work in loving and leading their families. Absolutely love this powerful reminder of what true masculinity looks like. Men who provide, protect, nurture, and guide. So I thought this was an interesting tweet to share because it shows that's her attempt to define true masculinity. So providing, protecting, nurturing, and guiding. And what I see there is it's all relevant to what men, give to others or what people receive from men.
Sacrifice.
Sacrifice, utility. Exactly. So that is I think that's pretty standard for a tradcon understanding and what they sell to men as what masculinity is.
And I will give her some kudos for using the euphemism true masculinity instead of saying real masculinity, which is the ultimate sort of shaming message that if you don't provide these things to
Mhm.
women, and when she's talking about nurturing, she means flowers and special days and lots of encouragement and pats on the back. Um, for me, I think that is sort of like taking a permanent 12-year-old with low self-esteem, and you're trying to bolster their opinion of themselves and the way they view themselves. That's what she's looking for from men as a
Y-
default.
yeah, and then this goes into I could just, it leads to issues down the line, or maybe women get these certain misconceptions about what men's responsibility for a woman's emotional world is supposed to be, and that men are supposed to be there to help her with her every emotional issue that she has, and if he doesn't know what mood she's in or all these kinds of things, it's just the biggest disaster, and he needs to be taken down for that and shamed and vilified.
Yes, absolutely. And what's really interesting is that in this ethos of sort of seeing men as these emotional nurturers, which it's in conflict historically, though. A lot of what most societies have viewed as masculine throughout human history is stoicism
Mm.
in men. That this is one of the requirements that for real masculinity throughout human history is that you're in total control of your feelings, you're in total control, and you act logically and stoically in life. But now we have the romantic ethos that's been injected in all this, and you have to be a psychotherapist and a counselor and a lover and sort of a coach in life to women. I'm not buying it, but I think that's the standard.
Yeah, I think there's two things there that I kind of see. And well, I have another tweet I can bring up and show that, but this concept of stoicism I think makes a lot of sense for men. And I think most men who have had experiences with women at some time or another probably figure out that if you bare yourself emotionally or become emotionally vulnerable like they tend to ask men to do, it's just not good for the relationship. Maybe they'll use it against you later. That's one thing, or it'll just kind of diminish attraction. And there's a ton of
It's an
women.
S test.
Yeah,
It is.
exactly.
When women want you to bear your feelings,
Mhm.
they're basically testing your masculinity. And if you bear your feelings, you fail.
Exactly. Yeah, you've kind of given up into her frame, so to speak. And a lot of women attest to this by saying it gives them the ick. I'll go ahead and share my screen here one more time and see if I'll bring up two examples. One of them that kind of brings up the discussion, and then another one. So this was on Twitter. I'd say about last week sometime, and it got a lot of likes, so it was, it struck a nerve, but it said, can men stop shutting us out when they're going through something? Let me in, be vulnerable with me, let me be your strength too. So this is the sort of, call we've heard. I don't even want to say it's just feminists. It might even be from tradcon women sometimes too, but it's all about you need to express your feelings, and a lot of men, unless you're inexperienced, know that this is a bad idea. And this is something that, in my opinion, can lead to the beginning of an end of a relationship.
Well, and it actually breeds poor mental health practices in men. This is started coming about in the 1980s as feminists were moving uh, really strongly into universities, particularly in liberal arts programs and psychology training, that sort of thing. There was this mentality that women brought into it that men were stoic and walled up, and it was costing them, and they were acting out unexpressed emotions with alcoholism, with violence, with all kinds of other things. And what they needed to do was to emulate women. The idea being that women had the emotional acumen, or what we're now calling is really a BS term, emotional intelligence, which
Mhm.
actually doesn't exist. But this is what they call it. But this is part of that mentality. But the catch is that even, and I saw this in the mental health field, when men opened up, when they heeded that call and they opened up and bared their souls, they were shamed by mental health professionals to no end. Now, can you imagine what the average woman does when the guy opens up and bares his soul?
I got an example here. And it this is just taken from a post on Reddit, but I've seen so many of these kinds of posts over the years. And even if you go to that last thread on Twitter and you look at the comments, so many men share this as an issue they dealt with. I'll try not to read all of this. But essentially it's titled, "I am no longer attracted to my boyfriend after seeing him get emotional." And so she's 23 and the boyfriend's 25, and they've been seeing each other for about 6 months. And she says, "He has always been the strong, silent type, and it's honestly what attracted me to him. He has been my emotional rock and looked after me, and I loved feeling protected and like I had someone so manly and solid." Then in this paragraph, she describes that, she noticed him coming home upset from work, but he really wouldn't say anything. And eventually she coaxed him on and said, uh please discuss it with me. And then she says, "Well, the other night, for the first time, he cracked." And then she uses this word crack too. "He started to get emotional about his job and how he feels like he isn't doing enough in life and how he worries something is wrong with him medically. He's on antidepressants and he doesn't think his medication is helping." She says, "I was completely shocked seeing him like this, and I began to comfort him, and it seemed like he was on the verge of tears. I held him and stroked his hair, and eventually he said he wanted to go shower, and I said okay. But as he got up, he went for a kiss, and I just recoiled. He seemed taken aback, and I just said it was an awkward position and gave him a peck on the lips. He gave a bit of a frown and went to the shower." Then she says, "This is going to sound horrible, but seeing him vulnerable and emotional completely repulsed me. I know it's wrong, and I'm wrong and horrible." See, and that's part of the programming there, where I don't even really blame her for feeling this way. It sounds
Right.
terrible, but she's just being honest about how she feels. But she's also confronted with these narratives in the culture that are saying you're wrong for feeling this way. So that's diminishing.
I'll take the honesty any day.
Yeah. So she goes on and says, "But seeing him in a moment of weakness made me just see him as not a man and was a turnoff romantically and sexually." This is also a callback. I don't know if you watched the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial that was
Yes.
televised, and there was a moment where she mentioned how weird it was her because she saw Johnny Depp cry, and she was like, "Seeing a grown man cry, I never even seen my father cry." It was like this weird visceral reaction. I sat there disgusted. Um, oh, let me just start back. "I know it's wrong and I'm wrong and horrible, but seeing him in a moment of weakness made me just uh, see him as not a man and was a turnoff romantically and sexually. I sat there disgusted with myself and thought, what was wrong with me? After he got out of the shower, he came to cuddle and he admittedly was trying to make a move, but I shut him down. This seemed to upset him more and he went to bed." So then she goes on, I'll just summarize this, but she says it's been almost a week. She's lost all attraction to him and it's looking like it's going away soon. So yeah, so you have this post on Twitter, it's upvoted 70,000 times or has that many hearts on it. And on the other end, you have stories like that where when a man does do that, like for them, I guess they've only been going out for 6 months. But if you're in a marriage, you're 5, 7 years in, and the wife's listening to this kind of programming online, and she sees that tweet and thinks, "That's true. Why doesn't my husband open up to me more?" And then finally gets him to do it. Pretty soon you're on child support and dealing with the family law court, and then nobody knows what happened.
All because you shed a tear in front of a woman.
Exactly. Exactly. So, that I
So
think.
I hope guys are getting this part of this message. This is what happens when you're not stoic with women. It's I mean, you can bemoan it all day long, you say you don't like it. It appears to be human nature.
Yes, yes, exactly. And that's, because there's I guess a couple ways to look at what masculinity is. And I think all of them are important. There's this kind of historical backdrop and trying to get clues there. Then there maybe is this kind of biological attraction backdrop, and you can see what creates and what diminishes attraction between a man and a woman, and those might give us indicators of what people see as masculine and feminine, from the opposite side that are separate from this. Hey, let me pay everything for you, or let me uh, doing all these kinds of utility sacrifice things that tradcons talk about.
I also wanted to point out, I saw something on television years ago.
Mm,
They were interviewing John Gray,
hmm
who wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And he was talking about this topic and men being emotionally available and vulnerable in relationships. And he said something that I think was phenomenally honest. And personally, I don't like Gray very much. He's a feminist. I think a lot of his theories are BS.
hmm
But he was being questioned about this emotional availability in men and men being in touch with their own feelings.
hmm
And he said, no, you don't understand. She doesn't want you to be in touch with your feelings. She wants you to be in touch with hers.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it makes
And it
perfect
was like,
sense.
wow, a bit of truth coming from John Gray. I thought it was wonderful.
Yeah, well, and see, a few things come to mind, but the first thing for me is like this is where tradcons especially get it wrong when it comes to cultivating, I guess, masculinity in men, because they won't really go over any of this stuff, but this is where the red pill becomes very attractive to guys trying to understand this. Because especially like earlier in the days red pill, maybe not a lot of the more recent hyper self-improvement, which is also being a utility. But it's, oh well, if you just sacrifice and be a utility and you do this and you buy the flowers and you do all these things and you help out with the chores in the house and wash the dishes
Be a
and
simp.
yeah, and rub her feet while she's tired or something like that. Then that's going to get you a good relationship. But there's all this other stuff in the background that they're not brought up, and I would even argue maybe not even really allowed to talk about in some places without getting beat up by both feminists and tradcons alike for daring to have those conversations.
I think tradcons are living a lie in that too,
Mm,
because rubbing her feet whenever she's tired, tending to her like a simp, does not get you the relationship you want. What it gets you is being taken for granted and disrespected
hmm
and seeing as less masculine. Again, I'm not making the rules here, but these are my observations.
Yeah, and I think when men see that, there is okay, if we observe that and it's true, then this idea of sacrifice and utility and providing, I think we can start to separate that from whatever the core is of actual masculinity. You know what I mean? Because then it comes to show like, well, you can do all these things and you could still be maybe the cultural narrative will want to say that's masculine, but it's still not going to work. And I would argue the way that it's intended. There's another Lila Rose tweet that I wanted to share, and it seemed like she almost unknowingly kind of separated these two things, but I thought it was interesting and maybe worth discussing for a bit. Just a second, I gotta wait for this stop share thing to get out of my way here. Lila Rose. Um. Oh darn. I think I might have misplaced it, but she was basically talking about how essentially both men and women should be sacrificing and doing all these kinds of things. I'll try to find it up if I can pick it up. I'll do it again later. Sorry about that. I can put it in
No problem.
after. Yeah, but so
We'll take your word for what she's saying.
yeah, I'll add it in afterwards. But essentially, so I start to look at these things and then I'm like, okay, and I'll be honest with you, Paul, I had a tough time because I knew we were supposed to talk about this. And I'm just like, what is masculinity really? It's almost like the sun is there, but I can't really stare right at it and tell you exactly, it's because it's this concept that's almost kind of too big to describe. I don't want to say that, but so then you start to look at, okay, what are the indications of masculinity? And for me, to venture out here on a limb, after thinking about it for a bit, I've tried to come up with my own definition, and this is this is informed by maybe my own interactions with women and just in life in general. And I tend to base it on just like this very reduced idea that masculinity is essentially wound in with the concept of being direct, and women, on the other hand, are more indirect. And I see this kind of exemplified in different places. Let's say there's a guy and he's mad about being in the friend zone with the woman. He likes her, but he hasn't said anything, and he's mad at her because, oh, she friend zoned me or something. And it's really his fault because he hasn't been more direct with her about maybe what he's looking for, or at least trying to make a move on her. It doesn't have to be as direct as, oh my God, I want you or something. But he hasn't tried to ask her out. She might be able to tell that he likes her, but if women are more indirect, why should she directly say, hey, if you don't make a move, then nothing's going to happen? Most women aren't going to say that. So a guy maybe who's not in touch with his masculinity will misplace that resentment towards the woman, not understanding that he needs to take more charge and be more direct and all these kinds of things with women. Another example, I just think about this. This was with an old girlfriend of mine, and this was like a second or third date, I think. And she needed to buy some shoes, it's like some running shoes or gym shoes. And so we went to the store, and when we got to the register, I was standing next to her, and she was paying for her shoes. And the person at the register asked once about signing up for an account, and then was like, "Are you sure? Here are some benefits." And then she said no. And then the third time, the person asked again, and then when that happened, I didn't even do this consciously, but I was like, "Can we just pay for the shoes without signing up for anything?" And then the person was like, "Yeah, that's no problem." So then the transaction happened, and as soon as we walked out of those doors of the store, she let out this huge sigh, and she was like, "Oh, thank you so much." And I even didn't know what she was talking about. I was like, "What are you talking about?" And she was like, "Oh, back there with the cashier." And then I realized that that's one of those moments that is, I guess, a masculine thing, or that women are attracted to in a man. I would even say that one moment probably got me a whole year of me spending quality time with her. You know what I mean? But it was something that rubbed off on me as like, oh wow, this is something that women like in a man, as maybe a masculine quality, being direct sometimes.
Sure it is. And, I think masculinity is kind of like pornography. Um, it's very, very difficult to define, but you know it when you see it.
Yes.
Uh, um, I think masculinity, the important part of it, I think, for men, though, is that you get that, yes, stoicism. I personally consider stoicism masculine. I consider personal strength masculine. I consider the protective qualities that a lot of men have toward the weaker are masculine features. But the moment that I let anybody else define what masculinity is for me, if somebody's challenging your masculinity, guaranteed they're trying to manipulate and shame you into their control. That's what they're trying to do every time. And so if we have this universally established definition of masculinity, if we buy into that too much, then we can be controlled for our whole lives. This is how we got men to march into wars. The white
Mm.
feather campaign. The white feather was a symbol you weren't a man. You weren't masculine. You were high, and men would, rather than take that white feather, they'd go into the meat grinder of the trenches of World War One and end up dead there. That's how powerful this messaging is that men will die in order to fulfill this idea of manhood. And I think that's where we really need to learn the lesson. This isn't the 1500s anymore. Um, People will use you and manipulate you until your death with masculinity.
Yeah, I see, and I think that is a very, very good point. And it does demonstrate how strong it is. And then on the flip side, from going to war, men will end their own lives because of feeling like they've fallen short of this, whatever the cultural narrative of masculinity or this standard. And it leads to all these negative outcomes. And I would say the tough part about all of this too, especially when I look at from a historical standpoint, uh, especially in the world we live in now, if roles were more defined based off of economic and survivability factors in the past, whether it was women had to be on the field or men were out pushing the plow. And nowadays, especially in this kind of civilization that we live in, both men and women more or less work similar jobs, except for some jobs are still dominated by men, the really hard ones and things.
Yes, the
But
dangerous ones.
but there's this narrative out there, and there's more of an ability for women, I'd say to kind of harken back to these older ideals and say, well, you should be living up to these now. And it's not necessarily that maybe you're not masculine. It's just that they're trying to get something out of you as a utility. So you might have a woman that's making as much money as you are, and she's still trying to say you're not masculine, even though it's comparatively it's a decent income. You guys can come together and create a strong household. She's going to say, well, the man's supposed to be, the provider. You're supposed to be making more than me. My money's my money, your money's our money, and all these kinds of things. And men, I think nowadays going forward, especially, need to sort of confront this idea of what was masculinity in the past. Is that really real anymore? Is what they're selling us something that gets us to be used? Is that masculinity? You ever heard Nietzsche say God is dead? And I don't think he meant that as in God doesn't exist, but what he was talking about was, and this is going to be a loose retelling, is that modernization and all these advances in society had made the believability of God harder for people to do. And with that kind of came, without this idea that kind of roots all of our morality and ideals and values in. And as people start to doubt that, it leads to a kind of rotting away of ideals and values, and that it would lead people into this period of nihilism because they're trying to search for meaning in their lives. And they may search for meaning with who knows what, just trying to distract themselves with sort of indulgent kind of things. And when I look at masculinity, I sometimes see that too. It's almost like masculinity is dead. And we're all here trying to search and figure out, what is masculinity. And then you have maybe tradcons over here that are trying to prop up this dead god idea of masculinity and say, no, this is masculinity. This still works today. This still works today. But behind it, there's no substance behind it. So.
And there's also no similar curiosity or
Mhm.
drive about femininity. We don't hear people say you're not a real woman, or women don't get told to woman up.
Yeah.
Uh, we don't even, uh, femininity can be anything women want it to be,
Mhm.
period, end of story. And no man is even allowed to have an opinion. Uh,
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean,
um,
sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you.
no, no, that was the complete thought.
Yeah, it's funny because I was thinking about how those words are used in language also, and when it comes into my attempt at a definition here about direct versus indirect, it's just like, like a man, especially with other men, it's just like, well, why wouldn't he say that directly to him like a man? You know what I mean? Like, why don't you man up and say it to my face or something like that? By the way, I also found the tweet from Lila Rose I was looking for, and I think it
Okay,
dovetails
great.
into this nicely. But she says the best use of your femininity or masculinity is to protect, nourish, guide, mentor, and serve others. This applies to people single and married, with children or without. This simple moral rule helps clarify a lot of confusion and extremes, and it's interesting because I thought this tweet shows, whether it's right or wrong, but this is okay, if it's true that both masculine and femininity can protect, can nourish, guide, and mentor, then maybe these things are removed from actual masculine and femininity. This guy here, I thought it was funny. He says, no, that is masculinity. That is not femininity at all. And it kind of maybe would even reveal a little bit hints of a sort of undercover feminist in her as well, trying to take on part of a man's role, if you want to look at it that way.
Well, I give her at least a little credit
Mm.
for mentioning some these as characteristics of femininity,
Hmm.
serving others, mentoring them. Although I got to agree with Joe Enders there. Uh, I think what she's really describing is masculinity. Uh, but it still, there is just no counterpart to the expectations that we put on men about masculinity. And I ask people frequently, I try to get anybody, name me one good masculine trait that is not also a good human trait.
Yeah, I struggled with that as well because when I was thinking about it, as I was thinking, okay, what's masculinity? And then if you name these things, like even sacrifice and utility from just that basic thing. And if you think about a woman, let's say a mom who devotes herself to her family and does these things, I can argue that there's utility, obviously, from the woman's side as well. And there's even sacrifice. They're sacrificing going out there and having maybe a certain lifestyle to be at home with their family and with their husband and with their kids and all that stuff. So both sides are kind of doing this sacrificing and utility and however, whatever that deal happens to be between the man and the woman, I guess. But if that's the case, then maybe sacrifice isn't just relegated to the field of masculinity here. Um, and it's something that should be expected from both sides. You can say, in their own
I have
way.
a theory about it. I
Hmm.
think that the reason that we attribute these strength characteristics, all these positive things to masculinity,
Hmm.
is because men, and I know some women won't like this,
Hmm.
but men historically have represented the best of humanity, sometimes the worst, but often the best. Those characteristics of nurturing, of mentoring, of teaching,
Yeah.
of protecting, providing, all those things have been historically performed by men, not so much by women.
Yeah, that was the other interesting part of her tweet there. So it's like it doesn't put it doesn't acknowledge that as much, I would say. And when I go back to this definition that's been sort of, you know, helping me along in my struggle here to understand this of directness. A lot of the stuff, that they're going to associate with masculinity, like direct confrontation, like when it comes to protecting, at the end of the day, there has to be this push come to shove, rubber meets the road. And, if men are going to be better at, say, going to war and protecting, then that's the case. Okay, you can say that's more direct there. And these other sort of, I don't know, just confronting things head on. I think that might also dovetail somehow into how men process and look at emotions. But then when you have this sort of slow encroachment, I guess, onto masculinity or saying it's bad or saying that women can do it too. It just confuses the heck out of everything. And then you end up with this husk of what either of them is. And then we're here like, what is masculinity when you really, really try to get to the brass tacks of it all?
And then you have really, I think Donald Trump would say low IQ individuals like Andrew Tate. I think you showed
I
me
have a
something.
I have a tweet from him actually that's
Let's
perfect in
take a
this.
look at that.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. Okay, here I'll read it aloud. This is Andrew Tate on Twitter. He says, "I feel like taking these Twitter gurus talking about masculinity, putting them in a room, then kicking the F out of all of them at once. Me versus 10,000 generic dorks, Mortal Kombat, 10 life hacks to masculine gayness. You're too scared to even fight in the cage. Be quiet. Any man who hasn't fought pro isn't allowed to comment anything. Mindset, masculinity, any of it."
Well,
I think that's the kind of far off other side. Like when I see that's the kind of hyper masculine um sort of approach there that I think comes off so bad it almost just justifies, you can say feminist attacks on men or these sort of bad stereotypes and caricatures. It's a very cartoonish caricature, like you shouldn't even be allowed to talk about this. And you guys are all weak, by default for not having done these things, you know.
first of all, compared to my AR-15s and my 45 ACP, Andrew is not that tough. This is a lot of bluster, but I think all he's accomplished there is, well, two things. One, he's provided us an absolutely retarded definition of masculinity, and he's given feminists somebody to point at and say, this is why young men shouldn't be listening
To
to
Andrew,
Andrew Tate.
or all of the
And
manosphere, even.
yeah, all, and then by extension, the rest of the manosphere should be disregarded. And it's why I really hate seeing Andrew Tate being called red pill. It just irks me to no end because this sort of moronic attitude about masculinity, this sort of tough guy on the internet, and he's a tough guy. I'm not taking that away from him. I know he's a badass in the ring, but to basically all this is a narcissism exercise where he's saying I'm the only man in the room.
Yeah, that's the problem there. And then, it's interesting because okay, that's one aspect, and that's maybe taking directness to its ultimate end of being able to beat people up and doing all this stuff and having the courage to all that kind of stuff. Me personally, I don't think there's such a thing as like being all the way that direct. I think it is some mix of both, almost like a yin yang. If I'm this direct, or I could be so direct, let's say in my conversation with you, Paul, and I think I'm the man and I know all these things. If I'm not, let's say have a tiny bit of the other side in me, whether that's indirectness or enough to be able to receive, when you're telling me something, I might not even hear what you're saying, and it might be wise, good information that would help me as a younger man to be able to become better here. And that's how you end up with this sort of whatever Andrew Tate is selling, which might lead more young men to end up less cultivated, so to speak. And this contrasts with, maybe a religious definition of the roles of a man. I think tradcons on one end too, if you look at sort of the religious, discussions, teachings, whatever, however you want to call it, stories. On the one hand, there's this Andrew Tate thing, which is like everybody get in the ring. And then on the other end, there's the symbol of like, turning the other cheek or doing this ultimate sacrifice of being crucified for everybody and all this kind of stuff. And those things are at complete odds with each other. And I think it leads more people confused. So the answer, if you want to call it an answer, whatever is going to work, needs to be somewhere between this spectrum,
But I think we find that if you look at the ancient Greco-Roman cultures and their notions of masculinity, they all included wisdom.
hmm
It wasn't just strength. It wasn't just holding property or
having,
protecting and providing or the warrior mentality, which has also been a big part of masculine definition. Wisdom is counted among that. Uh, Sort of deliberateness of mind, stoicism, that comes with that. And of course you don't get that from like if I can beat you up, I'm the man.
yeah,
um, that's not that reflected, and it's not on the other extreme that you pointed at too, where we see a lot of tradcons sort of take this model of Jesus. And yeah, a real man, you let yourself get beat up and spit on, and then you come back and you serve the people that did that to you. Um,
yeah. And I think all of those definitions have their place in the kind of grand understanding here of what masculinity is. Problem is I think people that are maybe very simple-minded will take one or other of these and try to paste that upon the entire thing or how you should be acting all the time, which can lead guys to ruin. I mean, if you're kind of overly aggressive there, like Andrew Tate, that's going to lead to problems for a young man in his life and for the rest of the society. And if you're overly, I don't know, complicit, or I don't know what you'd want to call that on the other end, that can lead to a society of weak men or something like that with a lot of the problems that we might have. So there is a time and place. And like you mentioned, the sort of wisdom and the understanding of when to apply, maybe being direct or less direct or whatever it's going to be, is ultimately going to serve people a lot better and all of society going after that.
that brings a question I think is worth exploring too. There is a notion that, and again, I just look at bits and pieces from different cultures throughout history and got some of these recurring themes through there. But one of them is also value to society.
hmm
And I think this is where we get into really tricky areas for men, because one version of value society is the willingness to walk into a war zone.
hmm
perhaps to fight for corporate interests somewhere, which is what a lot of our wars have been about.
Yeah.
Um, and I believe that masculinity is tied to value to society. But I look at it more through the lens of like I see what you do as a masculine contribution to society, not so much what Andrew Tate does.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think there's some level of if of masculinity being of value to society, but also I think properly expressed, it's not only a value to society, but also a value to the person themselves. There was I don't know if you read the Plato any Plato before. There's a book called Plato's Republic, and
I
when
haven't.
well when we discussed having this conversation, I was reminded of it. This is the book right here. It's kind of Plato's magnum opus, and the entire book is about Socrates having a conversation with some other Athenians about what justice is. And it's interesting because the book opens up with basically the other interlocutors giving their own sort of common sense definitions of what justice is, and it could be something as simple as being honest and paying all your debts. It could be doing harm to one's enemies and doing good to one's friends. It could be justice as basically, might makes right in the interests of the stronger. They decide what justice is, and there's these sort of common sense definitions, and basically the more they pick at it and pick at it and pick at it in the story, they start to get a little glimpse of maybe what justice really is, in the kind of platonic form or ideal sense of it. And eventually, Socrates describes what justice looks like in an individual, and then what justice looks like in a city. And basically, a man having his desires and his spirits and having that ruled by reason and temperance and wisdom and all these things, and not letting them be out of check, even if he's by himself, is still a justice. And then with the city, every person kind of doing their role and contributing is a just city. That's a very loose discussion there. But when I think of masculinity, I think it's kind of the same things. We all kind of live in this cave, so to speak. This book also gave the famous allegory of the cave
Okay.
metaphor. And we all live in this cave of sort of culture, and there are these sort of common sense definitions of masculinity, or things that people are like, this is what masculinity is. But the more we try to pick at it, hopefully we can get at something that is more truer to the definition of the word, that is, maybe beyond just utility and serves not only yourself, but your community, and is helpful, I guess, in the grandest sense of the word.
I have some conflict about that
Mhm,
sometimes when I look at the what we'll loosely call the red pill community,
mhm.
because there's several different factions, as you know, in that there's MGTOW, there's
The
PUAs,
PUA.
we got even you could even loosely say incels or some sort of reaction in men, and call that part of the red pill group. But what I do see commonly, and I try not to say too much about it because I don't want to engage in the sort of man shaming that goes on. You see guys that have rejected all this abuse,
Mhm.
the sort of women's idea that you're here to serve me and to make me feel good and to pad my uh, wherever I sit in life. But these guys basically say, okay, well, my life is going to be I'm going to hit the gym. I'm going to live for me. I'm going to get a hooker every once in a while, and the whole world can screw itself.
Yeah.
And there's a part of me that wants to say, man, that isn't masculine. But I refrain from doing it because I don't want to be a hypocrite. But I got to say that there's part of me when I hear that hedonistic, I'm going to indulge, my sensory life
Mhm.
until I'm dead and everybody else can go to hell. That I think, man, if there's missing the mark on manhood, that's part of it too.
That's I think that's such a great point you bring up, because it really highlights the more recent sort of struggles with masculinity. And yeah, the P, I used to follow the Red Pill subreddit back in like 2013, 2014. That was like my more of my earliest understandings and introductions to it. And there was this kind of maxim that was thrown around that was enjoy the decline. basically. So they are like, well, we live in this clown world, enjoy the decline. Here's how you can, I guess, maximize. I don't want to say having fun, but basically getting your needs met. And it is this very kind of taking of masculinity and making it a sort of, and I think this is why self-improvement became such a fixation with this community, all the way up until a hyper self-improvement leading to Andrew Tate, which is all about Bugattis and doing all these kinds of things, and maybe the sleep with 50 women routine, is because they believe that the deal masculinity is shamed so much, and when you play into whatever prevailing society is telling you to do, it just leads to men getting screwed. So it's like, fine, they're gonna say we're not masculine, but here's a way you can be quote unquote masculine for yourself and screw what everybody else has to say. And I think your instinct about something being wrong with that is completely true, because I think in the maybe truest sense of the word, or expression of masculinity, it would help both the individual and society itself. So this is why tradcons hate red pillars so much, because they're just like, you guys are being selfish and you're just doing all these hedonistic things, and you're helping to actually destroy society. Red pillars, on the other hand, say, well, you let it get to this point, you guys did nothing, and we're just using us as kind of slave labor. And I guess I can understand why it's at that point, and the hardest thing is trying to reconcile this stuff.
Well, and I know I can tell you from personal experience with this, having a period post-divorce many years ago where I definitely pursued the hedonistic lifestyle. A lot of the guys in the red pill community that don't buy into the hedonism are guys that have tried it and found it lacking.
Yeah,
Uh, that sort of pursuit of sexual satisfaction and adulation and attention from women as a sole pursuit in life ultimately runs into an emotional brick wall and
that's an
isn't very
excellent
fulfilling.
point. That's an excellent point. I I 100% agree with you. Even in my own life, there is a point you get to where once you've been with enough women or done that enough times, it just, it gets to a point where you're just like, okay, that's just what it is each time, just a variation on a theme. And then you start to think of, something greater. This is where I think I personally appreciated men's rights, especially men's rights focused movements. Was I have a someone else who, another creator, it's complicated. And he has this interesting thing. He says MGTOW is men's liberation for the individual man, but men's rights is the liberation for, collectively for men. And he has this kind of interesting macro micro way of looking at it. And unfortunately, it's just like, in order to, I think, reconcile this kind of stuff, somehow there needs to be this meeting in the middle where tradcons or whoever comes in and tries to say, these are the changes we're going to make to try to make a new deal here that gives men more reason to buy in. Because you're right, the red pill stuff of just, well, sleep with 50 women or whatever, it reaches a wall. The wall is a perfect word to use for that, because red pillars love to use the word wall for women, but there is
Yes,
such a thing for men too.
the hedonism wall.
Yeah.
And you do hit it if you have that kind of success. If you're, I guess, fortunate enough to have it, you end up finding it isn't that much to have to begin with. It's basically masturbation with a little more window dressing.
Yeah, I that's a great way to put it too, or using women to masturbate with, essentially, is what you're doing. There's nothing being built there. And it's funny when you said that you have that conflict. I kind of went around and asked different men in my life what they thought masculinity was, cuz I have this feeling that, like, masculinity is so hard to pin down. And some of the discussions I had with folks, uh it's I even asked my dad. I saw my dad and I was telling him I was going to be having a conversation with you, and I was like, what's masculinity? Like, what does it mean to be a man? And he sat there and thought about it, and he just landed on responsibility. And he didn't say, like, responsibility for a woman or a woman's feelings. He just said responsibility, whether it's to your family or people or whatever it is, household and this kind of thing. And then he told me that if a man doesn't have responsibility or he can't find that, then he's a nothing. So he was a little harsher about how he said that to me.
I'm not that far from agreeing with that. I mean, certainly, if I were to be the one who could define what a man should be, if I could define
Mhm.
masculinity, which I cannot, and nor would I ever want that awesome responsibility to define such a thing, but I would have to include responsibility to something
Yeah.
in there, to your society, to a family, to a cause. I tell clients all the time that men who aren't connected to something greater than themselves are almost always lost.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think that's how you get depressed people too, and then they tend to lack a kind of meaning in their lives. Now, this is a very real problem, and then you'll have tradcons and feminists who will try to hijack this very real problem and say this means you should serve us how we say you should serve us. But I agree with that notion completely, and even in my own life, the things that make me feel happy or all this kind of things is me being responsible for stuff, whether it's other members of my family or my work or this kind of stuff and researching things and trying to learn about stuff or to my own health or even to some extent is I think is one of the biggest factors there. So, and so that's what he said. Then I asked, someone else that was around my age and they said, well, being able to get what you want done in the world, like exerting your will on the world. And we had that discussion and it was very different from what my father said. So this is a person around my age. And and then he says, like, if you're not able to do that, then, you're not the man basically, or a man. But then further, he said, as far as justice, then he says, well, justice and order comes into this, but you need a strong men like that to be able to lay down the law in the first place, anyways. So that was his
I don't
younger
know, Shah.
definition. Yeah,
If masculinity is measured by inflicting your will on the world, we
yeah.
have a lot of masculine women in this culture
Well, that was the
because they're getting their way.
yeah. So that was the thing I noticed when I contrasted it with what my dad said. I was like, I think the wisdom of an older gentleman makes more sense because it takes this sort of raw masculine energy and it has it refined and sophisticated into some way that or cultivated into something that is not good just for men in the long term, but for everybody. The problem is we're in this place where men unfortunately are constantly put in positions and they call that masculine and you have little control over your labors and what you're doing. I mean, your kids can be taken from you if the wife leaves you and you're dealing with family court and all this kind of stuff. You have little control of, I guess, to go to the younger, definition of putting your vision, whether it's into your own family or your own children and being the leader proper. Unfortunately, instead of being leader, sometimes it feels like being the servant all the time and backed up by the state. So men are in this position of, well, these sort of cultural understandings of masculinity keep leading to our demise. Is masculinity really dead? To kind of go back to Nietzsche there. And then should we all be defining our own masculinity? Or is that maybe not a good idea? I don't know.
I think
Mhm.
starting there is or having an element of that to how masculinity is defined is very important. It's like I go back to it's I can have all kinds of standards for what I think masculinity is, and I can use those things to hold myself to the obligation to leave the world or society a little bit better place than I found it,
Mhm.
or I can use it to impose my will on other men and shame them into conformity with what I want to see men do, which is what I see tradcons doing wholesale. They have just pulled out all the stops on male shame. So
Yeah.
there is a conflict there, but I think it's fair to say that leaving the world a better place is a masculine feature, but I'm just not willing to shame other men who don't hold the same belief.
Yeah, I feel the same thing, and I think at bottom, like in nature, like that's why I've tried to reduce it down to directness versus indirectness. And another conversation I had, I was actually chatted with Peter Wright about this a bit too, and he had an article on gynocentrism.com, which kind of talked about like this plural idea versus this monolithic understanding of masculinity. and he discusses old Greek, maybe gods and goddesses and Jungian archetypes, and there's these different archetypes of masculinity that express itself. And this kind of makes me think that in different cultures and different times, there are there's different archetypes or understanding of masculinities that tend to be called upon for different times. You know, you might have the warrior, you might have the hard worker masculine, you might have the warrior masculine, you might have the sort of king ruler masculine, and all of these seem, in one sense or another, I think, to align with this idea of being direct. You know, ordering something directly, or meeting somebody out in battle directly, or working on your craft and getting the job done and building things and hands on and, you know, solving problems basically. But then, you know, it starts to get a little hairy because it's like, well, okay, you know, where does femininity fit into that? How much of the same stuff do they do in terms of solving problems or things? But that's where I'm at right now, basically, on the whole thing.
I'm right there with you, and I think unfortunately what we're contending with right now with both feminism and the romantic model has co-opted this ability to define masculinity, and they've redirected it toward
Mm.
it's masculine to make women happy and give them what they want.
Yes.
Uh, and that's where I really encourage all men to just draw a line and reject that notion of masculinity altogether, because it'll make you a slave.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that too. And then, you know, at the end of the day, if you're doing that, you're not really living your own vision. You're just kind of being held hostage to be given something, you know, whether or not it is a family. And some guys will take that deal and play that role, but other men who might be more masculine will say no and might lead to the end of the relationship or whatever. But some guys just can't do that. That's just not who they are on the inside. I One other thing I tried to do was think about figures in our life that maybe represent masculinity, and what is it about them that's masculine? Like, I say Trump, for instance. You know, a lot of people associate masculinity with Donald Trump, and there's something about his character, the way he does things, that people like. You know, like, oh, he's a real man. He gives it to you straight. You know, he says what he's thinking, or he doesn't beat around the bush with this kind of
It's
stuff.
another way to say he's trustworthy.
Yeah, basically, he's telling you what he thinks. Like, even my old dad will say that whatever you feel about his policy, at least he's straightforward about uh, what he wants. You know what I mean? Which people might see more a quality of a man. With the woman, you know, women will even say like, "Oh, well, I shouldn't have to tell you these things, or you should just know this kind of stuff," or like, you know what I mean? Because they're more indirect. They want to. You can say femininity wants to be acted upon, maybe by masculinity, and if you get to a point where a woman has to say, "Well, this is what I need you to do," the attraction's dead right there. It's gone. You know, so there's this indirect sort of notion coming from them, and then there's men who are supposed to be the more direct ones. You know, there's that proverbial, the woman drops her handkerchief or whatever on the ground, and then the guy's supposed to come and approach. And my mind has been kind of fixated on that. And it's like, okay, if this is the core, then if I look at our socioeconomic environment, however the culture is, I should be able to build some current understanding of masculinity that fits in for the era at the time. But it's not this single monolithic thing, you know?
It's not that simple. Yeah, I mean, you also have the mentality in women that they think, okay, I'm $100 short on my light bill,
Mm.
so I'm just going to make it known that I'm short. I'm not going to ask him, will he give me some money? I'm just going to let it be known that there's a need there. And it's his job to calculate what he's supposed to say to push me into taking this money
A
so that
real
I
man
can
would
have to
offer to
ask
pay
for it.
for
A
it.
real man would just offer, he wouldn't need to be told. And I am happy to encourage men to reject that notion of masculinity. I've made it kind of an art form. I love telling women, say what you mean or forget it.
That is a beautiful example, and it kind of makes me think like this is also why tradcons and feminists hate red pillars, because they do expect us to be direct. You know what I mean? More so, and by us being as direct as they expect us to, at least in those, you know, however their character of us is, it allows them to control us more, because then it's like, well, you're supposed to do this when I do that. But red pill, in this weird way, teaches men how to be more covert in getting what they want instead of being more overt. Like let's say you brought up a S test, earlier, and most men probably fail those tests when women throw that at them because they hear it literally and they're going to use their left hemisphere of their brain to answer it as straightforward as possible. But sometimes, you can play with that and you can do an agree and amplify or something to highlight how ridiculous it is. Like things like that they talk about. Or when a woman's like, she can trick you into thinking it's masculine by being direct about your emotions and your feelings with her, and you should be okay about talking about these. And then that screws you over when really you're not supposed to do that, especially not with your romantic partner. So there is this sort of element of a dance in between it and this kind of covert communication versus overt communication. And the red pill sort of covert communication, which they've seemed to zero in on, allows them to exploit attraction from the other side to get what they want, because if I'm not going to be this open about my emotions with her and she's just like, there's something and I can't get them to open up, she might be more likely to throw her body at me to get that sort of validation or whatever it is, So that's a very interesting thing to think about there and how that works together with it.
One thing's for sure, I don't think men's emotional experience and women are a good mix.
Yeah,
Uh, I take
no.
emotional issues and I speak about them with other men stoically. We process data and information,
Yeah.
not here's how I feel all the time. Because the moment you engage women into this stuff, they they absolutely lose it for you. It's just like that post. That was a brutally honest post. But women have been screaming at men, open up about your feelings.
Yeah.
Only when men do that, it's over.
That's a great point. I find myself being the same way. I mean, I have a set of friends. I mean, I'd consider them my brothers, and I will talk to them about that kind of stuff, and it's different. I'll be there for them too, but I won't do it with women. I refuse to do that. I've tried that before. I think most guys early on. It reminds me of something. I once had a woman I was seeing call me, and she was like, "How come every time I call you, you're just everything's good. You're either reading a book, you're just drinking a cup of tea." And I didn't tell her why, but in my mind, I'm like, because I never ever bring up how I'm feeling to you, and I never will. You know what I mean? And it's just like, it's funny
That's
because
wisdom speaking.
she was digging at trying to get me to like open up and talk about my problems, and I'm just like, why would I do that? Like in my mind, I'm like, I don't need to do that.
Like she was really interested in your problems.
Exactly. And I was like, oh no, that's the first step to failure. Like, hey, listen, I don't blame you, but I'm at least smart enough at this point to understand not to walk down that road. And then they'll shame you and be like, well, like when I see this, not her, but when I see this stuff on like Twitter or whatever, well, you're just insecure, or you're just a little boy on the inside and you can't be,
Or you're
open.
incompetent with your emotions because
Exactly.
you're incapable of articulating them.
Yeah, that's the perfect one too. And the fact is you can almost say the whole family rests on a man's ability to be able to do that and not fall for those little traps along the way.
And I've
Otherwise,
got
it's like,
news for women. Being a slave to your feelings is not the same thing as having emotional mastery. It's just the opposite.
yeah, exactly. So, in a man, there has to be this ordered sort of understanding and prioritization of when it's right to deal with an emotion and when it's not, because certain situations, you can't just panic. You got to be there and directly confront the issue without letting your emotions take hold. It's a disaster once that happens. And men have been expected to do that for the longest amount of time. So,
The only real value to our emotions is to inform our actual behavior.
yeah.
It's if you're scared of getting hit by the bus, that fear will make you take a couple of steps back from the curb when the bus is approaching.
Hmm.
That's an appropriate way to handle feelings.
Yeah.
Women tend to regurgitate feelings and recycle them uh, into infinity,
Yeah.
and they never reach a landing place with them but the process was what was important to them. And most men just aren't wired for that kind of emotional process.
Yeah, I mean, in what you're saying is true. I mean, men have emotions, and we deal with them in it's not that men can't have feelings, or men do have feelings, but we just tend to deal with them in a different way, and women seem to kind of project those out, you know. And listen, men get emotional too. I mean, we've even seen it from red pill gurus who will sit there and start yelling and screaming on a microphone to some of the women across the table. That's a complete emotional outburst. You know what
Sure
I
it
mean?
is.
Um, but yeah, it's not, you know, obviously it's not bad for men to have emotions, but it's just about how we deal with that is completely different than how they want us to do that. And they're doing that, they're telling us to do it that way because it gives them some kind of power over us. You know, it's like a chink in the armor or something like that.
I agree totally. And I think as a sort of a to put a cap on this conversation a little bit, I think it's really important for men to get the message that you're a man because you say you are, period. And that's the end of the discussion. There is no, you're not a real man or you are a real man. That is for sort of what Donald would call low IQ individuals. That conversation of whether or not you're a real man because you do XYZ is really kind of brain dead, in my opinion. You're a man because you say you are. You don't need anybody else's standards. But if you're looking for standards, I offer stoicism, strength, the ability to tell women no, I think is a masculine feature in this day and age.
I'd agree with that. I'd say, you know, maybe if I was going to put a cap on it on my end also, it's you know, maybe being honest with yourself and taking the time to think, you know, who you really are, what your values are, or what you believe in, instead of what other people are telling you is what you should believe in and what you should be doing, especially as a utility or sacrifice to others. And once you've decided on what that really is, then I think a feature of masculinity is being able to hold those values and stay true to them, and you know, be your own man that way. So it is up to men, especially nowadays in our society.
And if you retreat from any of that for the sake of men or women, not very manly.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That would be like kind of simping there in the end or something. Submitting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And a lot of men go for conformity. I'm glad there's a subset of us that are eschewing that sort of life for something better. I think that's a good enough place to close up for
Yep.
today. What do you think?
I think so too. Maybe we could pick up some more of this later, or you know, it's a huge
We-
subject. So I think we made some good inroads here and explored this a bit.
Guys, look forward to your comments on this. We read them all. And they help us inform other discussions. So enjoy. Thanks, Shah. It was great to see you as always. And guys, we'll see you next time.
See you next
Bye bye.
time.